Hi all, and welcome to Lecture 10. Our apologies for not being able to do this in person last week. We've also swapped out. You may have noticed in the handbook that this is Regina's lecture. I'm still Mary, but I'm going to be putting this lecture together for you. I taught it last year, so easy and smooth enough for me to pick up. This is our halfway lecture, and in one sense, this topic of sustainable development is largely what the whole course is about. So we've started at the very beginning. We're going to go up to contemporary times and even consider things into the future, where we're asking questions about how our economies put together, what development is and what's good for people and what's good for the earth, and how different people have different visions and conflict over that. But we're also going to talk about this specific phrase, this kind of unique combination of these two terms being put together largely for the first time in a public discourse way in 1987. So if you're thinking about the long arc of the course, we've got hundreds of years behind us and just a few decades left for our halfway point. So we have talked about how and why earthiness matters across the different lectures. But it would be a bit of a stretch for us to say that we were talking about a thing called environmentalism in many of the earlier lectures. We've talked a little bit last lecture, 2 lectures ago, around socialism and to some extent some similarities in terms of how environmental problems were being experienced in socialist countries, that particular kinds of economies were causing material harm. But we're kind of in a moment here of a 1960s-ish emergence of a thing that was called, in the English language, environmentalism. To remind ourselves, that's not to say that people didn't understand that the earth mattered before that, but that this term environmentalism came up, and that what it meant in the 1960s and today is slightly different than the way the earthiness had mattered before. So, of course, the earth shaped people, and people knew that what things were available shaped what they produced, shaped what they ate, shaped how their societies were formed, shaped what kinds of politics were possible, linking here to the questions from 2 or 3 lectures ago around modernity and energy, and the idea that how we get our energy shapes the kinds of economies and politics that are possible. Similarly, that equation goes the other way, that people shaped the earth was well accepted. Of course, people knew that when they dug holes that impacted the ecosystems, that farming produces a different kind of ecology. And more broadly, that many political wars were fought over resources, that countries that had more resources tended to have better armies. Again, so we're not trying to say that there was no conceptualization of earthiness mattering. Similarly, there's a long-standing conversation, a long-standing awareness. I talked particularly about this in the lecture around property. The idea that we could improve land and get more stuff from it, and that there's a role for science or experts in giving advice about what kinds of practices would help increase the amount of stuff we could get from particular properties. That much of the justification, in big air quotes here, much of the justification for enclosure and taking land was that certain kinds of property rights were understood to enable more stuff to be gotten from that property. So this idea of improvement was very much linked to ideas of property, ideas of science, ideas of a certain kind of environmentalism that some would call conservation, although today that often means a thing for like natural areas, but the idea that we would conserve resources and also get the most from them through these scientific expert instructions on how to use land. So all of that is highlights from lectures 1 through 9. So what's new in this moment, new in this 1960s moment of environmentalism that we are going to talk about today, was the idea that humans could fundamentally impact Earth systems, primarily in negative ways, right? Environmentalism was a concern about bad stuff. And that some of these harms were things we couldn't see, but that our health was impacted by negative human actions human actions that caused bad things for our health. Now, again, ish is important here. It's not that people didn't understand from the lectures on cities, the Industrial Revolution. People knew that smoke would harm you if you breathed it for a long time. People saw that when lots of people were moving to early cities, they were less healthy than the people living on farms for the most part. We can trace these ideas back even further. The Romans, using lead pipes for water, understood, not right away, but came to understand that there were negative impacts from the stuff they were using. So it's not brand new, right? But there is a moment of environmentalism that was distinct, not radically different, but a distinct moment where it became a thing that regular people were thinking about, regular people talking about. The word environment became a household term in the US and the UK. And this environmentalism was not just a critique of what was happening in terms of the material health impacts, but it also is entangled with this long-standing social critique. This long-standing social critique of production or consumption, a long-standing critique that our economy was valued more than some people thought it should be. That material life was taking on too much importance in terms of what we thought made people happy, in terms of how our politics were run. So we want to link this environmental concern to a very material, earthy thing, but also recognize that environmentalists draw on hundreds of years of cultural critique. And sometimes the two of those are hard to disentangle. We'll get to that again in our second to last lecture, where we're talking about some contemporary versions of environmentalism and the extent to which they're really concerned with material earthiness, or more concerned with a cultural critique that people are being too much focused on production and consumption. So we want to link environmentalism to this longer history of critique of morality, that focusing on material things is not what makes us good Christians, and recognizing this European history and European connection here. It's not what makes people virtuous. Okay. That history is much longer. Again, I'm pointing here, but the final part, what's more new, is this question that production and consumption might fundamentally threaten the material world. That was more unique in this moment. So again, placing our 1960s in this longer arc of history and the longer arc of the course. You've just recently had lectures on socialism and decolonization as things that were very much in the public discourse in the 1960s when environmentalism was coming about. We usually don't talk about the intersections between the three of those things. But in this course, it is important for us to recognize all of those things happening at the same time and potential linkages between them. That there is some connection between the modernist push for socialism and the negative environmental impacts that were happening in the Soviet Union, but also that people who were critical of the West and the materialist direction of cultural change, but also the earthy impacts that were harming people. Some people were concerned that our political economic system was what was causing it. Okay. There's also a development narrative that was happening in the 1960s, and that's what this picture here is. It's a classic 1960s understanding of what developing countries should do in order to achieve Western standards of living. The idea was if they could get their political and economic systems right, they would eventually reach this era of high mass consumption. Again, recognizing that some people thought high mass consumption is the moral ultimate life that everyone aspires to. Some people were critical of whether that was actually a good goal. But in the background of our lecture, okay, in the background as we're thinking about the context in which this environmentalism became an everyday concern, is the idea that developing countries were told a certain pathway was a thing to aspire to, that the material lives, which we were increasingly understanding as contributing to environmental harm. The developing countries were told that that was what they too should be aspiring to. So we have all of this stuff going on in a moment where environmentalists started ringing a bell to say environmental problems are big, they're real, they are important, and they challenge the way that we organize our economies. They challenge the way that we have been living our lives. We, in this case, is an open question in terms of who that we is. And we'll talk over the next 10 slides about how there's been a shift in terms of who the targeted we is for environmentalism. So in many ways, the early 1960s moment, there was a focus on environmental problems in developing countries. Now, this is an important historical observation and a thing for us to continue thinking about over the next 10 slides, but also over the next 10 lectures, about how the environmental movement framed poverty, framed developing countries. It's not to say that there was no pointing the finger in the global north. One of the canonical foundational texts, Rachel Carson, talking about DDT as a poison, that was very much a thing being used by Americans in the United States. But things like the burning of the rainforests, things like the growth of the deserts, which we don't talk as much about now, but it was a really big deal at the time, that often in these early moments, the kinds of environmental problems that were pointed to were things happening near the equator in countries understood to be developing at the time, and a strong blame of poor people for causing these environmental problems. Okay. We can see this in imagery from the time. One of the key things that was understood to be causing environmental problems, which we're going to put an asterisk by, have a longer conversation at another moment, or happy to detail that if it's an interesting point to tease out more. Overpopulation was absolutely seen to be crucial for why environmental problems were happening. We can see in pictures like this Time magazine cover, yes, there are people of all races on this cover, but why and who was narrated to be central to the overpopulation problem was often described as a thing that people of color were primarily the ones responsible for overpopulation. Now, again, if we place this in the longer arc of demographic change, it is certainly a moment where who is having more children changes. But this is part of the finger pointing that was happening around environmentalism, and part of why many people struggled with this framing now and in the past. Okay. So we have this feeling in the 1960s that something isn't right. We have scientists increasingly documenting a range of environmental problems. These environmental problems are not just about whether we can produce enough stuff, but also that in producing stuff, we are causing harm to ecosystems and causing harm to humans. Much of this, again, pointing at the problems in the global south, and in certain versions, arguing that the economy should slow down or the economy should produce less so that environments could be protected. Now, many people in the global south, as you might imagine, having recently gone through a process of decolonization, now, for the first time in hundreds of years, being countries which, at least in theory, could define their own fate, could create their own economies. Suddenly now, here comes this discourse coming from Europe and the United States primarily, saying actually environmental problems mean we need to rethink economic processes. We need to rethink what kinds of technology are being used. There's a famous speech given to the United Nations. You can read the longer quote here, but the short version is a pushback against the idea that poor people are the ones who are responsible for these environmental problems, who are primarily responsible for cutting down the rainforest, for causing desertification. And that speech was part, certainly not the only, but part of a wider push to reframe environmentalism away from being a thing that poor people cause by farming and growing stuff in fragile environments, to being a way that development can happen with environmental protections in mind. And so we have this emergent term of sustainable development. Development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So there's a book from 1987. I was 6 years old. Most of you surely a long while before you were born, but this is starting to enter into a more recent moment of thinking about environmentalism, not only as a thing that has negative implications for the economy, but a thing that can be incorporated in terms of how we do development. It sounds like a lovely phrase. One of the things that has emerged as a critique in the 20 to 40 years since this is that, of course, everyone is for sustainable development. Who wouldn't be for sustainable development? But when it comes to understanding what choices lead us to sustainability, what sustainability really is, these are political ideas. These are ideas where people will disagree. But this broad rhetoric of sustainable development that we all cheer and get behind doesn't necessarily help us with these actually very difficult decisions. And so the first reading that you have in your reading from 2005, so it's old, but I think many of the arguments are of the moment and yet still apply, is the idea that sustainable development has become a thing that just about everything can fall under, and in other ways, absolutely nothing really counts as. So sustainable development came about as a widely understood term through UN global processes and were seen as a thing that could be embraced across the global north and the global south, but also was mixed up in these very high-level conversations by very powerful actors, and in many ways kind of rode over the question of trade-offs, the questions of who decides, the questions of power and politics. Okay. So this is the 2005 article calling sustainable development an oxymoron, and what I just finished saying. Okay. And what some people have argued in the decades since is that instead of understanding development as a thing caused by poorer people, it is to challenge the idea of who is responsible for environmental problems. Okay. So again, we're trying to place environmentalism in this longer arc. Some of what I'm going to say now, it seems probably for many of you fairly self-evident and obvious because that's the environmentalism that you were raised on. But what we want to do is try to understand it in this longer historical arc, in part because the connotation of environmentalism means something very different, particularly to people who are even older than I am and living in the global south and may well have experienced versions of environmentalism that felt like they were targeting people of color as being the problem, that felt like people were targeting poor people as the problem. And so when we use terms like environmentalism and want to understand why some people really dislike the idea of environmentalism, what they may be reacting to is not sustainable development is a good goal that all of us should have to protect the earth for future generations and ensure there's enough for us. What they're reacting to sometimes is this longer history that we're trying to make sure we are thinking about in the lecture today and beyond. This longer history of finger pointing in terms of how the problem was narrated, who was seen to be responsible, who was supposed to be making sacrifices, who was supposed to be doing things differently. So this, you see my little pointer there. This is a fairly well-known thing called the Environmental Kuznets Curve, EKC. And it is a very simple picture, critiqued even by some of the original people who were drawing it, of an idea, and an idea that very, very poor people don't degrade the environment very much. But then they go through this process of development where environmental degradation is serious and important. But then if they earn enough money, eventually they start to value the environment and protect it. And eventually, even though incomes are very high, the environmental degradation goes back down again. Intuitively, for some of us, that picture makes sense and resonates with how we imagine the world. And many people arguing for sustainable development, implicitly, sometimes explicitly, argue that this is the pattern, right? What we need is development. What we need is to get people out of this low to middle income life where they are compromising things. They are making the environment worse in order to increase their incomes, grow the economy. And eventually, when they have enough money, they will prioritize the environment. Many people intuitively think there is truth behind that. Much of what happened under sustainable development was inspired by charts like this. The idea that if development happens and incomes will go up, then people will value and protect the environment. When researchers have tried to get evidence and see whether or not this is really the pathway that countries take, short version, it's really controversial. Slightly longer version, this has been disproven time and time again. Slightly longer version, it depends on what you measure and where you measure it. Whether the environmental degradation of my backyard is what matters, of my country is what matters, or environmental degradation caused by the things I consume and the things that were used to produce things like the roads, things like the sewers, things like the airplane. Those numbers will really impact whether or not a thing like this holds up. In contrast to this idea that poor people cause problems and rich people eventually value the environment and don't cause so many problems, was a very influential text called The Environmentalism of the Poor. And what was argued in that text was we need to rethink what environmentalism is, expand our understanding of what counts as environmentalism when we're thinking about who the real environmentalists are. And he didn't override the argument that sometimes poor people will cut down trees in the rainforest. Sure, that happens. But it was trying to understand that many times what poor people in the global south were advocating for through their politics was not seen to be environmentalism. But he argued we could see it as environmentalism, even if people aren't using that term. And so he argues that many things that are construed as livelihoods protests were actually about protecting environments, not so that the elephants and tigers would be preserved in a park, but because certain kinds of livelihoods were being threatened. And these livelihoods were ones that were deeply entangled with certain kinds of spaces and places, but that these livelihoods were, for the most part, understood to be sustainable. In many ways, this would be sort of the opposite of this kind of a chart, where the argument here is a fairly low income, sustainable livelihood, maybe it's this PID over here, is happening with low impact. And rather than go through this curve, maybe we could just preserve these not super high income, but sustainable livelihoods of people living off of the land. Against things like dams, which would cause environmental problems, as well as displacement. Against things like enclosure, which you remember from a few lectures ago when we talked about property, the idea that enclosure enabled people to improve the land, but also use different kinds of technologies that would have long-term repercussions for sustainability. Against cutting down the forest, because the forests were places that were producing all kinds of stuff that people were using. And so this moment, this sort of 1987, let's go back further. In the beginning, a kind of 1960s, environmental problems are happening everywhere, but a lot of finger pointing at people who were poor, people in the global south, a lot of concern with this idea that high mass consumption was doable for everyone. And in the 30 to 40 years that came afterwards, a lot of questioning about how we frame responsibility for environmental problems, about who the targets of our actions should be, but also a growing set of questions around what sustainability is, what is possible, and we will continue to carry forward these questions around how to achieve sustainability, what it is materially, but also what kinds of political systems, what kinds of economic systems, what kinds of political economic systems enable us to achieve that goal of sustainable development. So you may have seen more recently, and this, I imagine, resonates for many of you with how environmental problems are framed in your growing up times, in your sort of everyday understandings of who the targets for environmentalism are. So again, key here is not, is this a brand new novel slide, but to contrast this slide with the slides that have come before. Okay. So we see in our contemporary discourse a notable framing that overconsumption or wealthy areas are part of the problem. We'll see particularly in the next lecture on neoliberalism, this idea that how people consume is the problem rather than that they consume is the problem. So there's a moment here framing overconsumption, but as we'll see in the next slides, in the next lectures, there's a question as to whether or not consuming less or consuming differently is the solution. Okay, so we see this turning point towards paying attention to the high consumption consumers, but also raising a question as to whether or not consuming less or consuming differently is understood to be the solution. Why this shift happened is an ongoing question. Certainly the negative perceptions of environmentalism in terms of targeting low-income people, people of color, didn't go over well, didn't convince a lot of people to take up the environmental cause in the majority world being places with low income, places with people of color. So there may be an understandable pragmatic shift, like we saw with the Indira Gandhi quote, that pragmatically environmentalism, if they wanted to get other people on board, needed to shift away from blaming to creating a vision of sustainable development that is something that people might positively aspire to. But also, we'll propose in the next lecture the idea that capitalism found ways to take the environmental narrative and incorporate it within its systems of profit. That companies, some of them, realized that environmentalism could become a tool of branding, could become a label they could put on stuff and charge more money for it. The extent to which capitalists, big international companies, to some extent, maybe not fully embracing, but at least embracing the rhetoric of sustainability, may have shifted our thinking about who is responsible, is something we'll tease at a little bit more. Okay. We also have in your materials some pointers, a link towards the Sustainable Development Goals. Again, Sustainable Development, a kind of 1980s term. In some ways, I think in the Global North and the Global South sort of faded from the everyday terminology, replaced by sustainability. An interesting set of conversations we could have about why development sort of fell out of that phrase. But a push to put this term back into the United Nations public discourse. There were Millennium Development Goals. We're going to skip over those as a moment that was older and a bit outdated by now. Millennium Development Goals trying to get international funding, big boosts of money to re-energize development for low-income countries, developing countries. But a concern that in doing these Millennium Development Goals, sustainability was not considered to be part of the agenda. So rebranding, but also including the environmental agenda were the Sustainable Development Goals. You can have a look at what they are and some understanding of why they are and what geographers might contribute to them from your readings. What I think is the most interesting part about these Sustainable Development Goals is that they are part of a broader push to treat the North and South as different, still recognizing that they are different, but a strong push that sustainable development is for everyone. Okay, so here in the UK, we are also meant to be pursuing sustainable development. That was true in 1987, but it's not really the strong push, I think, in terms of how in 1987, how, where, and why, and who was supposed to be doing stuff. But the argument for the Sustainable Development Goals is that they really are something that all countries are meant to be aspiring to. Certainly, they have been critiqued. Every different way that anyone has ever proposed to do environmentalism has been critiqued by some people. Certainly the critique of the Sustainable Development Goals, a key one is that these are top-down, led by international development agencies. Those metrics do try to measure sustainability that is being pursued by other actors, but it's also hard to coordinate, hard to measure, how to count what changes are happening through these bottom-up initiatives. Okay. So here's our forward-oriented moment. Okay, we're coming towards the end of the lecture here, where this is a moment halfway through our class where we are pausing to look at the big picture. Okay. We have shown the extent to which politics, economics, and the environment have always been entangled. Even when people didn't use words like environment and ecology, they knew that the earthiness mattered. Earthiness shapes what kinds of economies, livelihoods, development, politics are possible. It shaped how much stuff there was. The colonial moment radically expanded the amount of land and resources that Western Europeans understood to be out there, and materially, how much stuff they were able to grab, control, put on ships, take on board, and use. So we've seen in the kind of hundreds of years that have led up to this moment, a radical change in terms of how much stuff there was understood to be out in the world and under the control of particular economies, particular countries, particular nations, particular companies, particular people. But in that process of grabbing, taking, controlling, and trying to improve land resisted. The resources resisted, not with any sort of active agency, the Latourian actor network stuff. There's some messy terminology there. But what we saw very explicitly in the lecture about energy and oil and modernity, what authors have traced across many different other kinds of materials, is that the world was not infinitely malleable. We couldn't change it as much as some people thought. We couldn't control it as well as some people wanted to. We saw this very strongly in this socialist planning where there was an idea that with enough science, enough control, enough centralized authority, enough will, that the earth could be bent and made to be the way that we wanted it to be. Not only in socialist countries, but especially in some socialist countries, the impact of that was terrible for the earth, terrible for other species, leaving toxic legacies that humans today are continuing to deal with. So this idea that there was this emergent political economy and a bunch of ideas that were shaped by earthiness, by the expanded earthiness that happened through the imaginary. But it wasn't infinite. And this moment of the 1960s to 80s was a very clear moment of attempting to reckon with those limits. We didn't talk about limits to growth, but you may have heard of limits to growth as a moment where people literally were talking about the limited ability of the earth to provide. Throughout this, there has been less central, this has been less central to our arc, but it will become more so in the lectures that follow, is what exactly is development? What is good for people? What is the thing that people are materially aspiring to? And as I said in the very beginning, for hundreds of years, people have questioned whether or not material quality of life is really the thing people should be aspiring to improve, right? How central consumption is to our sense of well-being is a question humans have asked for hundreds of years. But it becomes more central in the lectures to follow. What is development? What is the good life? What is it that people are trying to do when they mess with the earth? How political economy shapes our answers to what is sustainable and what is development are things that we will continue to return to over the subsequent lectures. So, in sum, sustainable development, sort of what the whole course is about, sort of what this particular moment around the 1980s of trying to reconcile who's bad, who's the problem, what is an environmental problem, where is an environmental problem, who is responsible, a way of trying to create an umbrella term that everyone can be excited about, but in doing so, erasing, not fully erasing, something over, papering over, there's the phrase I was looking for, papering over some of those differences that continue to trouble environmentalism today, as we will continue to talk about in the lectures that follow. Thanks, guys, and we'll see you in a few weeks.